So did you guys know I was in Israel? Anybody know that? I was gone. None of you even noticed. None of you, actually, I heard that. I was like, were you gone last Sunday? We heard Pastor Linda. We weren't really sure if you were here or not. So, I'm actually wearing a veil right now. This is not my real face. My face is actually shining with God's glory. I didn't get to go to Sinai, but I was close. So I wanted to share with you a little bit this morning my trip to Israel. Now, I know how boring it can be to get invited over to somebody's house for dinner and they show you their slideshows of a trip. Well, guess what? You're at my church, so what's up? What can you do about it? I mean, you get up to leave, and I will pray against you. I'm just kidding. I would never do that. But I did want to share some of the things that God spoke to my heart and that I experienced. Is that okay with you guys? Awesome. And if you didn't say yes, then too bad. All right. So this first slide is actually a picture of the nation of Israel. Now, you can't really understand the size of Israel until you go there. Israel is tiny, right? This is a nation that's one of the most important places on the planet. It's the center of political arguments and just warfare and just crazy stuff. And it's this tiny little nation that's no bigger than the size of the state of New Jersey. All right? This is not a big place. You can travel all the way across the nation of Israel in 45 minutes. Yes. You can travel from north to south in Israel in less than 3 hours. This is not a big place, but yet it's the biggest place in the entire world because it's the center of everything that God has chosen to do for our salvation. So up at the very, go back. I'm sorry, Taylor. You're doing a good job. So up at the very top, you see that little green spot? That's the Sea of Galilee. Then as you travel down, you see that bigger blue spot. That bigger blue spot, that's the Dead Sea, and it is very dead. And everything that's orange is Israeli territory. Everything that's yellow is actually belongs to Israel, but it's under Palestinian control. And that is intentional. They've allowed the Palestinians to have self-rule, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. All right, so we got to Israel. It was a very long day of traveling. I actually left last Sunday at 2 o'clock with Pastor Nathan Hurst of Grace Family Church here in the Quad Cities. We went to Chicago, spent the night in Chicago, got up at 5 o'clock the next morning, got on a plane to New York, hung out in New York all day with the group of pastors that we were going to be traveling with, getting to know them, had a lunch. Then we got on a plane. We went through Israeli customs. Now, if you ever complain about TSA, I will laugh in your face because Israeli customs are straight up scary, right? Israeli security is the best on the planet, and so don't ever complain about having to go through a metal detector until you have 20 Israeli people asking you questions about why you're going, what you're doing, and where you're coming from. It is intimidating. We got through all that. We boarded the plane at 11:50 at night. We flew for 10 hours straight to Israel, and we landed in Tel Aviv. Now, Tel Aviv is a very cool city because it actually surrounds this old city named Joppa. Now, Joppa in the Bible has significance because it's right on the Mediterranean Sea. You can't actually see it there, but you can see Tel Aviv on the screen about halfway up the nation of Israel on the left on the Mediterranean side. And this is where, how many of you guys know the story of Jonah and the whale? All right, this is where that all starts off. So, I got up early. You can go to that next picture now, Taylor. I got up, I could not sleep. I got there, I think I got 2 hours of sleep, and I was vibrating. I just couldn't, I was so excited. So I got up at 3 o'clock in the morning, called Amy and the girls because we were 8 hours ahead. So 3 o'clock in the morning there was 7 o'clock at night here, which was really strange. And talked to them for a little bit, did some work on my computer, and then at 5 a.m. I went out to the Mediterranean and walked along the beach where Jonah tried to run from God. Right? So this is actually a picture of the Mediterranean looking out into that body of water that we read about all in the Bible. If you've ever read about the Romans or the Greeks or anything, this is the body of water that all of that takes place in. So that was pretty cool start of the day for me. Next slide. All right, so how many of you ever heard of Caesarea? Anybody ever heard of Caesarea? All right, this is a wicked cool city. This is the city that Herod the Great built. How many of you know who Herod the Great is? Okay, Herod the Great, you'll read about him in the New Testament. Herod the Great was considered to be the richest king in Israel's history, even richer than Solomon, some people say. He did all kinds of building projects. This guy had more money than he knew what to do with because he was a very wicked king, and he controlled all the trade routes. So all of that money that went through trade through Israel came into his pockets. So Herod built the temple. He built the temple in the time of Jesus, which was amazing. He also built some cities. This is one of the cities that he built. So what you're looking at, if you see this wooden structure down here in the bottom right hand, and then you see that wall right to the left on the bottom, all right, this is the remnants of Herod's temple. Not Herod's temple, Herod's palace in Caesarea. Where that picture is taken, right there in that corner, is where the Apostle Paul wrote 2/3 of the New Testament. Isn't that amazing? He was held captive. He was in prison for 2 years in this city, awaiting to go to Rome. And this is where Paul, this is where the Bible actually comes alive. This is where the Apostle Paul, from prison, was writing much of the letters in the New Testament. In the background, you see that flat place? That's called the Hippodrome. Imagine 80,000 spectators sitting there along that. It's about a half a mile long, all these bleachers. All the bleachers on the left-hand side have been eroded and destroyed by the Mediterranean. But this is where they did horse racing. This is where they did gladiator games. This is where they did the Olympics. This was actually the first place where they awarded gold, silver, and bronze medals in the Olympic Games. And the reason that they did that was because in the original Olympics, you would prepare and train and travel and go to this great expense. And if you won, you know what you got? A laurel wreath that was like $1.70 that you could make for yourself at home, right? So Herod, being the man that he was and wanting the whole eyes of the world on him, he put up the money every 4 years to give away gold, silver, and bronze medals to the winners of the games. And so the games really began to grow in Caesarea. Next slide. All right, so the top of this is kind of cut off. That's actually Pastor Nathan there on the left. This is actually a statue depicting Elijah. How many of you have ever read the story of when Elijah faced off against the Baal prophets in 1 Kings? Okay, this is a really cool story. We'll talk about it in a couple of months. But this is actually at the top of Mount Carmel. So this is actually the location where the prophet Elijah squared off against the prophets of Baal, and God rained down fire to consume his offering, to show that God was real. And the 450 prophets of Baal did nothing, and they died. But so they did something. But this is such a cool space. Next picture. Okay, so you walk up this flight of stairs, and your guide tells you, wait for it. And you're like, wait for what? I'm walking upstairs. And you turn around, and this is what you see. This is the Valley of Jezreel. You may know it by another name, Armageddon. This is the location of the last battle for humanity. This is the location that all of the armies of the world will come together and face off at Armageddon. It's not a Bruce Willis movie, all right? This is the real place. And as you're watching, you can see from the left to the right, you can actually see the entire 40 miles of the Jezreel Valley that starts at the Mediterranean Sea and ends at the Jordan River. It's just an absolutely breathtaking, amazing view. Now, what you can't see, well, what you kind of can see is down at the bottom by the tree line is the Israeli Air Force. So we're standing up on top of this Mount Carmel, talking about the significance of what we're doing there, reading about the story between Elijah and the prophets of Baal, and one by one, Israeli fighter jets are taking off out from underneath the mountain, and it's so loud you can't even imagine, and you're standing there going, that's why nobody messes with Israel. Because one of their fighter jets can take out 10,000 soldiers. It's absolutely amazing. All right, next slide. So, the reason for this picture is you see the sign above my left shoulder? What does that sign say? Do you get why that's funny? This is the mountain where God rained down fire to consume. So me and two other pastors saw this. We all got selfies with it because we thought it was hilarious. Everybody else was like, why is this funny? Like, you guys are idiots. But we thought it was hilarious. So, okay, next slide. This is the picture of the first time that we got to go to the Sea of Galilee. And the amazing thing about the Sea of Galilee is you go up to most bodies of water and it's flat, right? Like it's flat going down to the water. The Sea of Galilee sits in a bowl. It sits in the midst of mountains. It's surrounded by like 3, 4, 5,000 foot mountains in a bowl. I mean, it just all straight down into the water. It's such a cool place. But this was the first time I got to step foot into the Sea of Galilee. This has remained largely untouched for the last 2,000 years. And as I stood and came out to the edge of this water, I had one of those moments where I'm sitting here looking at it going, this is where Jesus was. This is where Jesus hung out. Next slide. So obviously it didn't work for me. I tried to walk on the Sea of Galilee, and it didn't work. I went straight into the water. I was a little disappointed. I had to give another pastor $20 because I really thought I could do it. But all right, next slide. All right, so this is the church. Now, this is the thing. So hopefully in a couple years, you're going to go to Israel with me because Pastor Nathan and I are going to get a group of people together to go back to Israel within the next 2 years. And so hopefully you'll get to go. But one thing you have to get ready for is everywhere you go, it does not look like it did in Jesus' day, right? Jerusalem itself has been destroyed 38 times. It has been destroyed more than any other city in the history of the world. And when they destroyed Jerusalem, they didn't like carry the rubble out because it's up on a mountain. They just piled everything and then built on top of it. So there's all these different layers to all of Israel. They call them tells, and they're just layer upon layer upon layer. So you're walking around and you're like, okay, so is this Crusader? Is this Byzantine? Is this the time of Jesus? Is this from the Romans? And so they kind of explain to you what layers that you're looking at. This is the church that's built on the top of the Mount of Beatitudes. Do you guys know the Beatitudes, the beginning of Matthew chapter 5? Blessed are those who are poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. So go to the next slide. So you can see here what it would have been like for Jesus and his disciples. So this is standing up at the top of the mountain, looking down. This is a pretty steep slope, but this is the slope that Jesus came up with his disciples. And there were hundreds, right, if not thousands of people sitting on this hillside right here as Jesus came to the top of this and was teaching them the Beatitudes and was teaching them the Sermon on the Mount. This is the Sermon on the Mount location. Next slide. All right, so this is very cool. So this is the ruins of the city of Magdala. What does Magdala make you think of? Who? Mary Magdalene. This is the home of Mary Magdalene, one of the most famous followers of Jesus. Next slide. It's really kosher. So I didn't really understand what kosher meant until going to Israel. You cannot get anything unkosher in Israel. You even try to order a pork chop, they will punch you straight in the face. Like there is no pork. You do not get cheese except at breakfast because cheese cannot be mixed with any type of meat whatsoever except for fish. That's kind of yuck, right? Like cheese and fish, that they just don't mix very well to me. And the other fun thing is you eat salad for breakfast. So if you love fruits and vegetables as much as I do, I lost weight in Israel. No, actually the food there is phenomenal, the Mediterranean style food. But I did take a picture of this because I went in and I looked at the menu, and they have pretty much our menu, except it cracked me up as it says, the big fat American burger. And I'm like, what are y'all trying to say here? I mean, come on. But everything, it's burgers without cheese. So, that kind of, whatever. Next slide. All right, so this was a very, very cool place. This is a church on top of a church. So that little round circle that you see there is a Byzantine church from the 3rd century. This is about 300 years after Jesus lived and rose. But this church, this little round church, was actually built on Peter's house. So this is in the village of Capernaum. Capernaum was actually the center of Jesus' operations on the Sea of Galilee, in the Galilean area. So this is where he would have spent his time. So when you read that story about Jesus coming into Capernaum and finding Peter's mother-in-law sick with a fever, and Jesus raises her up so she can start serving, which I think is funny. Not hinting, Rachel. But this is actually the location of where that happened. This is where Jesus hung out with Peter and Peter's family. So next slide. This is the rest of the city of Capernaum. So this was actually a pretty large village, and you can actually see the walls and the structures. Now, in our minds, even in a crowded city area, you have a home, and then a couple of feet or a couple of yards, and then another home. This was not the way homes were built then. Everything was built in family communes. So you would have a central courtyard where people would cook and talk and spend their days, but then you would just have room upon room upon room upon room upon room built in a big square, and everybody lived together. So you'd have grandpa and grandma, you'd have aunts and uncles, cousins, brothers and sisters. Everybody would live in the same family complex for generation after generation after generation. And you can quickly see, standing up above this and looking at the alleyways in between these buildings are like 3 to 4 feet. So you can imagine why it always says that the crowds were pressed around Jesus and he could barely move. Because you get 2 or 3 guys walking in down that hallway or that sidewalk, and you can't move in these crowded places. And you got to imagine these houses were probably 10, 15 feet tall. So it was a very, very crammed, packed area. Next slide. So this is a synagogue from the 3rd century. So again, about 300 years after Jesus. But this synagogue was actually built on, like foot by foot, on the synagogue from the day of Jesus. So this was a pretty spiritually moving place for a lot of us, because we went into this synagogue, and Jesus taught in synagogues into every Jewish village that he went to. So we know that Jesus stood on this ground, stood on this site, and taught God's word to God's people. Next slide. All right, so this is Capernaum by the Sea of Galilee. And the reason that I took this was because, again, this is pretty much untouched for 2,000 years. This is the site, this is the place where Jesus would have called his disciples out of their boat to stop cleaning their nets. This is where Peter and these guys lived. This is where they made their living. This is where they were fishermen. This is the village where Jesus called them out of their boats and to follow him. And it would have been right here at this location. One of the cool things about a trip to Israel, what it does for you, is it literally makes the Bible come alive. Next slide. This is the city of Nazareth, where Jesus grew up. The interesting thing about Israel is that when you think of Israel, you think of what? Jewish people, right? Well, the majority of Israel is actually occupied by Muslims. So Nazareth is 85% Muslim. They've actually done a pretty good job of killing the Christians and the Jews that lived in that city originally. And the Muslims are, and this is not a negative thing against Muslims, because there are a lot of wonderful Muslims in the world, but it's not always the religion of peace that we hear about in our media. In fact, all throughout this nation, Christians and Jews are being forced out of their communities and their cities by the Muslim population, and it's usually by threat of death. We actually met a pastor that has one of the only Christian churches remaining in Nazareth, and he's been beaten, and his father's been shot multiple times. And this is what they live every single day of their lives, to just be Christians in this environment. Next slide. So this was the grossest thing I ate on my trip. They call this a Peter's fish. And so we ate this on the edge of the Sea of Galilee, and I'm not big at eating anything that's looking back at me. And so it was so funny. I was with this guy, and his name was Bobby. And Bobby's from Tennessee, and he's kind of got this Tennessee accent, and he looks at the waitress comes by, and she's probably like 18 or 19 years old, young Israeli girl, and she goes, "Well, you don't like the fish?" And he goes, "Honey, I can't eat anything with its eyes." And she goes, "Oh, I'm sorry," and rips its head off and goes, "Is that better for you?" And I was cracking up. And I looked at Bobby and I said, "Dude, she just owned you, man." And so for the whole trip, we're like, "Bobby, do you want us to help you out? Is this going to be okay for you?" It was pretty awesome. All right, next slide. All right, so we got to meet some amazing people on this trip because we were with Christians United for Israel, and we were a group of pastors. Every single day, they introduced us to leaders in the Israeli government. This was one of them. This guy right here is a bad dude. He literally wrote the book on infantry tactics for the Israeli military. If you don't know anything about the Israeli military, it's one of the greatest fighting defense forces on the planet. Every boy and girl in Israel serves in the military. If you're a young lady, you serve for 2 years. If you're a young man, you serve for 2 years and 8 months. It's mandatory for you to serve. So everybody knows how to fight. Everybody knows how to do this. And they know what they're doing, right? This is a tiny little nation that's constantly fighting off 10 or 15 other nations bigger than itself. They know how to fight. He took us, this is an old Syrian military compound from the 1960s. How many of you guys have ever heard of the Six-Day War? So in the Six-Day War, this was 20 years after Israel had gained its independence in 1948. The Six-Day War, something like 7 or 8 nations, mainly Muslim nations, decided that Israel did not deserve to exist. They still hold that view today. In the Middle East, there are only 2 nations that say that Israel deserves to exist. They think they should just die. Like that's the sentiment over there. Oh, a Jew, they should die. They're dogs. They don't deserve to live. So he brought us to this place. Now, over his shoulder there in the background, you see that green valley? That is the site of the second largest tank battle in human history. Israel had something like 100 tanks. 7 nations came. Israel was outgunned 10-1. And after the smoke cleared, Israel had 2 tanks left, and their army the opposing army surrendered. Israel won the Six-Day War. Now, you'll hear a lot of things about, how many of you have heard about the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, the Golan Heights? This is actually in the Golan Heights, the northern part of Israel. Now, the reason that Israel has this territory is because people keep attacking them and losing. All right? This is why. The other thing is that you need to understand, and this is not stuff that you're going to hear in our press, because our media does not like the nation of Israel. If you go there, you get a little bit of a different understanding of how things are running there. Israel has allowed all of these nations that have attacked them. Israel allows the Palestinians. The Palestinians say all Jews should die. Israel doesn't deserve to exist. They allow the Palestinians to live on their land and self-govern themselves. The only time Israel steps in is when they start bombing and shooting them. This is a quote that I got. So one day we got to meet with this amazing journalist. He is an Arab Palestinian Muslim who's also an Israeli citizen. And you know what he said to us? He said the sentiment in the Middle East that the problem started when Israel started shooting back. Think about that. So the problem didn't start until Israel started defending itself. And that's why the Muslims are angry. And they'll also say this: we don't like Israel because they hit back harder than we hit first. And that really is their rule there, is if you bomb us, we will obliterate you. And they can do it. And so they're not always perfect. They do make mistakes. Israel is not a perfect nation. It's led by human beings. They don't always do things right, but they live in a very tumultuous situation. Next slide. All right, you see that fence in the background? That's Syria. That's ISIS right there. So this is from about me to about the end of the church building right there, that we're standing here looking at them, and they've got guards looking at us, and we're like, what else do you do, right? You just kind of wave and pray a missile doesn't get shot at you. I mean, this is where they live every single day. Next slide. Okay, so this is another place in the Golan Heights. This is a couple mountains over. And so in the background, it's kind of fuzzy for you, but you might be able to make out 3 different villages. Hamas, Al-Qaeda, Hezbollah, right there. Israel is surrounded by its enemies who are bent on its destruction. Next slide. All right, so this is the Sea of Galilee. So we went and toured and did all that stuff. Then we got to come back to the Sea of Galilee, and we got to take a boat ride at sunset, which was just one of the greatest experiences in my life. Like how you can have like one of those really just spiritually deep moments, just you and the Lord, and just like tears come to your eyes. I was starting to have one of those, and then a jet ski came right by us at about 80 miles an hour. I was like, seriously, Lord, come on. Next slide. So this was the boat that we were on. Very, very cool. Next slide. All right, so this is Father Gabriel. Father Gabriel is a Greek Orthodox priest Orthodoxy is actually one of the larger Christian sects in Israel. And his job is, right now, he's working to convince Christians. Because here's something, is if you're an Israeli, you have to serve in the military. If you're a Christian or a Muslim, you do not have to serve in the military. So Father Gabriel is working to convince the Christians within Israel to fight in the Israeli military in support of the Jewish people. And it's working. He gets shot at on a regular basis because the Muslim community does not like that he's convincing so many Christians to fight alongside of the Jews. Next slide. Any guesses? This is the Jordan River. This is not the location that Jesus got baptized in. That would have been further south, but you can't baptize people there because you might get shot. Just being honest with you. And so this is the place in the Jordan River that's actually completely, both banks are inside of Israel. And so they take you, this is called Yardenit. And you've been to Yardenit. Several of you guys went 12 years ago and went to this location. And so I got baptized. I don't know if you have Facebook or not, but there's a video on there of me getting baptized in the Jordan River. The bottom is very slimy. I wasn't expecting that. My feet went right out from underneath me. It was kind of funny. All right, next slide. All right, so you see that mountain right there? That is the nation of Jordan. So, again, an entire nation that hates Israel, and this country runs all along their western bank. And so Israel is completely surrounded by its enemies. Next slide. All right. You guys see the dome? So this is the first view that you get coming into Jerusalem. And so we stopped on this mountainside, and there's a ritual that you do where everybody drinks a glass of wine or grape juice. I think we had grape juice. And you drink a cup of grape juice, and you pray a prayer of blessing and safety over the city of Jerusalem. And as you look down, I mean, this is the view that you see. You can see the Dome of the Rock. You can see the wall there that's going down into the city. And it was pretty moving to come into that city and know Jerusalem is God's city. This is the city that God has placed His name for all time and all history. There's a feeling there when you get there that you know where you've just entered. Next slide. All right, so this is the city of Jerusalem. This is actually the Armenian section. So there's 4 quarters in Jerusalem. There's the Armenian quarter, there's the Muslim quarter, there's the Jewish quarter, and there's the Christian quarter. And so we entered in through the Damascus gate, which led us into the Armenian quarter. So you see how wide that is? I could touch one wall to the other with my hands outstretched. This is the widest it gets. And you've got hundreds of thousands of people living in this space. You see the barred window there? These are apartments. These are where people live. And a little 2-bedroom apartment, $1.5 million. So when you hear about the Jews moving back to Israel, specifically Jerusalem, they are sacrificing greatly to live there and to be there because real estate is extremely expensive. Next slide. So this is a beautiful mural that's painted on the wall. And so standing here, this mural is about 50 feet below street level, okay? But where the mural is at used to be street level in the time of Jesus. So you can see how many times Jerusalem's been destroyed and they've just built and built and built and built and built. And so this picture depicts what it would have looked like. So you would have had your shops and your goods on the sides, and then down the middle, people would have been walking, and this would have been an open-air shopping center. And the reason that this is depicted here is that this is actually part of the pathway that Jesus would have been led down toward His crucifixion. Next slide. Anybody know what that is? It's the Western Wall, or what many of us know as the Wailing Wall. Now, this was one of the coolest experiences that we had because we got to go on Shabbat. Does anybody know what Shabbat is? It's Sabbath. So Shabbat begins at sunset on Friday night and is over on sunset on Saturday night. And so we got to go on the beginning of Sabbath with about 15,000 Jews. Now, there's different types of Jews, like there's different types of Christians. Like there's like the Seinfeld Jews, like that live in New York, and they're Jews in name, but they don't really practice anything. Then there's your moderate Jews that go to synagogue and they practice their faith. But then there's what we call Hasidic Jews. Do you know what Hasidic Jews are? They wear the black hats and the black clothes, and they have the peyot, the curly cues coming off the sides of their face, and they are very, very observant. They're almost what we would consider Amish in our country. They're completely removed from culture. All they do is study God's Word, and they have very large families, but they're very removed from culture. So we actually got to go. You see that little, the cavern on the bottom left-hand side there? We got to go inside there. And it was just an amazing experience to go and lay hands and pray at the wall. Next slide. All right, so this is a very cool wall. This was the city wall in the time of Hezekiah. So when you read the story of how they came back and rebuilt the wall after Israel had been destroyed the first time, this is that wall that had been destroyed and rebuilt. Next slide. Again, this is another picture of the Wailing Wall. It just shows you how close. So the reason that this Western Wall is so significant is this is the only remnant of the wall that exists from the time of Jesus, from the time of the temple. And so now the Dome of the Rock has been built on the location of the Temple Mount, the mountain where God's temple used to dwell and exist. So the Jews go down to the Western Wall, and the layer that you see the Jews standing on the ground is the only layer that exists from the time of the actual temple time. Next slide. All right, so this is the view from the Mount of Olives. Any of you guys heard of the Mount of Olives before? All right, the reason that this is a significant view is because the Bible says that when Jesus returns, the Mount of Olives will be split in two from north to south, and this will be the first place that Jesus' foot touches when he comes back to earth. All right, so this is the view. Now, this is a very significant view. You see all those white things down there at the bottom? Those are all Jewish graves. Jewish people spend an exorbitant amount of money to be buried on this mountainside, and they're all buried with their feet facing Jerusalem because they believe that when Messiah, when his foot touches the Mount of Olives, that they will all be raised from the dead, and they don't want to have to turn around. They just want to stand straight up and walk into Jerusalem with them. Next slide. Anybody know what this is? This is the Garden of Gethsemane. Very, very tranquil place. This entire garden is less than the size of this room. This is not a big space. There's all kinds of buildings and stuff built up around this. But the Garden of Gethsemane has been preserved largely because it's been owned by the Catholic Church for a very long time. And it's a pretty neat place. None of the trees are original from the time of Jesus because the Romans tore all of them up when they destroyed Jerusalem. But the oldest tree there is about 1,200 years old. But it is a neat location because they know this is the spot where Jesus prayed and sweated blood on the night of his crucifixion. Next slide. Anybody know what that is? That is the Eastern Gate. Now, the Western Wall is where the Jews pray. The Eastern Gate is significant because Jesus will enter through this gate when he comes back into Jerusalem when he returns. Now, here's something interesting. You see how the gate's blocked up? The Muslims have blocked the gate with rocks and stones. You see below the gate, you see all that white stuff? That is a Muslim cemetery. They built that cemetery because they believe that the Messiah would not walk in an unclean place. So they feel like this is their last sign of defense against Jesus returning into Jerusalem. I don't think he's going to have a problem. Next slide. This is a really beautiful church that is called, oh man. No, this isn't the Holy Sepulchre. This is in Bethsaida. So this is built on the location of where they believe that Mary, the mother of Jesus, was born. Next slide. Nope, that was Gethsemane. I'm sorry, that's the church at Gethsemane. I'm getting confused here. All right, so this is another picture of the Eastern Gate. I just loved this because I can't explain how strange this was to go here. So to get here, you have to go through a Muslim security checkpoint. and you walk by, and there's, and again, I'm not anti-Muslim. I don't like their religion, but I'm not anti the people, because many of the people are wonderful, sweet, loving people. But the religion's dangerous. And you walk through, and it's just the strangest thing, because you're walking through a Muslim graveyard on both sides, and you're standing at this gate, and you're looking at the Mount of Olives, and you're going, this is where it's all going down. Like, Jesus is coming back right here. Hopefully soon. Next slide. All right, so have you guys know the pool of Bethesda, where Jesus did the miracle where he healed the eyes of the blind man? This is where this is at right here. This is the pool area of Bethesda. Next slide. Okay, so you see how deep that is? So again, it's been built up, but this is the actual location of where the pool of Bethesda would have started, but it would have gone about 100 yards to the left that you can't see in this picture. But this is where Jesus healed the eyes of the blind. Next slide. Via Dolorosa. This is the pathway that Jesus would have taken carrying his cross through the city of Jerusalem to go to the place of the skull. Next slide. So you see how cramped that is? We walked the Via Dolorosa. There was never a point in that hour-long walk where I was not touching someone on all four sides of my body. It was so cram-packed. You're trying to fit about 100,000 people through a space 5 feet wide. It was crazy. The funniest experience that we had, though, was we had this really large guy with us, and these little kids came running right between his legs. And he's like, "You better get out of my business." It was very funny. It was very funny. Next slide. This is David's tomb, King David. Now again, city's been destroyed many, many times. They don't know if this is the actual, or we know this isn't the actual building, but they're pretty sure this is the actual site of where King David was laid to rest. Next slide. This is the church of the upper room. So this is the location in the city where the church began. This is where our heritage begins as Christians. Now, not this exact room, but the location of this marks the spot where the upper room would have been, where the disciples were at when the Holy Spirit fell. Also the place where Jesus would have held the Last Supper. Next slide. So this was honestly the most spiritually significant place that we went to for me. This is Caiaphas' house. This is the door that leads into the church of Caiaphas' house. And you can't actually see it here, but it's actually a 3D door where it's actually coming out at you. It's absolutely beautiful. Next slide. So this is a cistern. Now, many scholars and theologians believe that the night when Jesus was arrested, he was taken to Caiaphas' house. Caiaphas was the high priest, and he spent the night there. Many believe that while he was there, you don't have him hang out in the guest room. They believe that he was thrown down into this cistern, and this is where he spent the night. And the reason they believe that is because Caiaphas was known to hold prisoners in this cistern that was in his home. Next slide. This is what it looks like inside. It's about 8 foot by 8 foot. But it was one of the most solemn places I've ever been in my entire life. Just standing in there in complete silence, knowing that there is a very real possibility that you're standing in the same 64 square feet that Jesus occupied on the night that he died. It was very humbling. Next slide. These are the steps that Jesus would have been led, bound by Jewish and Roman soldiers to go to Caiaphas' home. These are the very steps that Jesus would have walked upon with his own feet. Next slide. This is the city of, anyone want to guess? Bethlehem. Bethlehem is not a very welcome sight for Christians today. The Christians have been driven out by the Muslims. Bethlehem resides in the West Bank, so it's under Palestinian control. And up until about 10 years ago, this was the favorite site in the West Bank where Islamic terrorists would shoot into Israel on a daily basis. In fact, they would their bombers would come from this city, and about 10,000 Palestinians a day would climb a hillside that I'm going to show you. And the reason that they had to put up a security fence is because, you know what they were targeting? Children's school buses. So after about the 10th school bus was blown to pieces and about the 500th child was murdered, they said enough is enough, and they built a fence. Next slide. So this is the hillside that I was talking about. You see that fence there? This is the most sophisticated security fence in the entire world. It runs 451 miles all along the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. The man who built this fence, you're going to see his picture in a minute, he was in Forbes magazine last year as the genius of security. Forbes magazine actually said the United States needs to learn security from this man. Now, if you see things in the media, you're probably going to see these huge concrete walls, and they're going to say the Israelis are holding the Palestinians captive. Only 5% of the fence is concrete. The rest of it looks just like this. There are no machine guns. It is not electrified. There are no mortars in the ground. There is nothing along this fence that could harm a person. This fence is so sophisticated because if you touch it with your finger, it will alert the border security to the exact inch of where you're touching the fence on that 500 miles. And they have paths to where they will have someone there within 5 minutes to respond to a person trying to cross this fence. I think this would work pretty nice for security. The other thing is that I can't show you is that along this fence, the Israelis are not keeping the Palestinians out. They have spent billions and billions and billions of dollars on checkpoints that people can cross through about 1,000 people every half an hour. And they have taken great means to make these checkpoints as non-dehumanizing as possible. They actually have sniffer rooms. You know what a sniffer room is? It's a room that you walk into and has a large vacuum suction, and it takes your smell and transports it into the next room over where they have trained dogs. But they don't even have the dogs come and smell the people because they don't want to embarrass them. These mean Israelites go to great lengths to try to show love and kindness to their neighbors. What they also don't tell you is that any time there will be between 40 and 50,000 Muslims being treated in Israel who are soldiers that had just been shooting at them days and weeks before. And they don't just bring them in and lop off a leg and save their life and send them back. Some of these people get treated 7 or 8 surgeries, 9 or 10 months of physical therapy before they get sent back home. Anybody can come and be treated in Israel for free. And this is their enemies. Next slide. This is the guy, he's not picking his nose here. I don't know. It was a bad shot. But this is the guy who built the wall. He is a colonel in the Israeli military. Next slide. So this was a fun place. This is the future home of the United States Embassy in Israel. Yes, that deserves a clap. That's awesome. The first time in history that America will have a presence in Jerusalem because we have now recognized Jerusalem. I don't care what you think about Donald Trump. I don't love everything that he says and does, but this was a good move. This was a good move. So what happens is we go here and there's this little roundabout and the bus driver starts cranking up God Bless America. And like all 30 pastors were up standing like shouting God Bless America. Like it was the most patriotic moment of my life. Like we were ready to go. We were just pumped. Next slide. This is the Dead Sea. The Dead Sea is shrinking 3 feet a year. So in about 30 years, it will no longer exist in many places. It's shrinking because they need the water that's running into it, and they're trying to figure all that stuff out. It's kind of a mess. So what you see dry ground there used to be Dead Sea. It's really hurt the resort areas because the resorts that were built in like the 80s and 90s are like 300 feet away from the water now. Next slide. This is Masada. Anybody ever heard of Masada? Masada is such a cool place. This was built by Herod the Great during his kingdom. It was built up on top of a mountain, and it was literally a luxury spa out in the middle of the desert. He made people carry hundreds of millions of gallons of water up a mountain so he could have a swimming pool. And he never visited there. He was just nuts. But what happened was in 66 AD, the Jewish zealots captured Masada because it had stores for 10,000 people. So they went to Masada, they captured it from the Romans, got the weapons that were housed there, marched on Jerusalem, and took over Jerusalem. But then in 70 AD, the Romans came and destroyed Jerusalem because of these people. So they left Jerusalem and they went to Masada. And when they were done, there were 967 men, women, and children. And the night before, the Romans came in because they knocked down the wall. The Romans went to their camp. And that night, all 967 people committed suicide instead of being captured by the Romans. Next slide. This is a picture of what the Masada would have looked like in the day of Herod the Great. And what you don't realize is when you see rubble, you almost think like everybody just has like skylights. No, there was roofs over everything. And so it's just really kind of bizarre getting your head wrapped around that. Next slide. So you see that, do you see the wall there that's built up? It's kind of at an angle. That's what the Romans built that with 10,000 soldiers in about 2 months. They did it by bringing rocks by hand and building this siege ramp. And then they put this big warfare weapon on top of it that broke down the wall. Standing up here, you're about 1,300 feet above the ground. It's kind of a bizarre experience. You take a cable car up and down off the mountain. Next slide. This was my second favorite place. How many of you have read Matthew 4 when Jesus is sent by the Holy Spirit out into the wilderness to be tempted? This is that wilderness. This is not the Sahara Desert. This is not the Mojave Desert here in the United States. This is a desolate place of rolling hills, and there's nothing there. There's just nothing there. It's 15 miles from Jerusalem to Jericho here. It's an amazingly beautiful place, but this is where Jesus walked 2,000 years ago with no friend but Satan there to tempt him. Next slide. The Garden Tomb. So when you guys get your invitations to pass out for this week, you see a picture on here of the Garden Tomb. And I didn't realize this until I saw it this morning. I was here on Monday. Like I was standing at this picture on Monday. Next slide. Okay, this isn't the tomb. Anybody know what this is? This is Golgotha. This is the place of the skull. Now, you can't see it well from here. But, so you see the big hole there on the left? That's not important. So, if you go over a little bit, you see the next hole in the side of the rocks? And then next to that actually forms eyes. And then down below it, it actually forms a nose, and you can almost see a mouth below it. So, this is the place of the skull. On that hillside is where Jesus Christ was crucified for our sins. It's where our Savior died, on that hill. Now, here's something that's truly amazing. At the very bottom of this picture, you can't see it, but it's a bus depot. Jerusalem's crazy, right? Like, you're looking at Golgotha, and then there's a guy selling shawarma next to you. You know, like, you want some shawarma? No, $2? $1.50. $1 for you. You big man, you like shawarma. You know, and so that didn't happen to me. At the foot of Golgotha is a bus depot. But these buses are interesting because these are the buses that are used to transport the Muslims from Palestine, from Palestinian lands into Israel at the foot of the cross, Jesus brings the Muslims. That was significant to me. Oh, by the way, have you guys heard of this Palestine? Have you guys heard the Israeli lands called Palestine? You guys ever heard that? The Palestinian Authority, all of these things. Did you know it's made up? The name Palestine did not exist before 135 AD. There was a Roman emperor named Hadrian who really hated the Jews. And so to mock the Jews, he came up with a fake name for the land that was Roman occupied. He said, we're going to call it Palestine because Palestine is a derivative from Philistine. And the Philistines were Israel's greatest enemy in history. So when you hear people say, well, I'm Palestinian, no, you're not. Nobody is. It's a made-up term. Next slide. This is the inside of the garden tomb. Now, is this the actual tomb that Jesus was laid in? We really just don't have a way of knowing. There's a pretty good chance that it is. And I'll be honest with you, when you walk in there, it's a pretty powerful environment to step in and look at that blank slab. Next slide. This is the outside of the tomb. Just a little bitty hole cut in the rock, nothing special, in the side of a mountainside. It's just a few hundred feet away from where Golgotha was. But there's several other tombs like this cut out in the side of the rock. Next slide. This is my last one. I don't even know what time it is. I'm probably going late today. I apologize. So this is a mountain. And what's significant about this mountain is that we've just read about this mountain. Because when God told Abraham to go into the land of the promised land, Abram stood on this mountain. And from this mountain, he could see, now you can't see the Dome of the Rock very well, but it's in the background there. He could see the mountain where God was calling him to sacrifice his son. You know the story of Abraham and Isaac? So Abraham took his son Isaac up on this mountain, just the two of them, and he pulled out his knife, and he was about to kill him, and God told him to stop. And when Isaac had asked his father, what are we going to do for a sacrifice? Abraham had said, God will provide the sacrifice. 2,000 years later, on that exact same hill, God provided the sacrifice, his own son. So when we talk about Israel and we talk about the Bible, here's my takeaway that I want to share with you. Guys, these aren't just stories. This is real life. Flesh and blood reality. And the reason that I wanted to end with this picture is because standing on this site right here, Abraham would have been looking at the place that God had called him to give up everything. What are we willing to give up to have relationship with God? Because the whole time I was walking in Israel, I was reminded of how easy I have it as an American Christian. I don't have enemies on all sides with guns waiting to destroy me and kill my babies. I don't get shot at or jumped in the street because I'm leading a church. I have it pretty good. So one of the things the journey that I want to take you guys on with me is I want to have an authentic faith. I want to have a life-changing, world-transforming faith that affects the people around me for the kingdom of heaven. Amen?